Greetings, welcome back to our study on Mark's Gospel. Today we are in Mark chapter 12, and we are looking at the first 17 verses. This is two stories, Jesus telling a parable, and then Jesus being asked a question by the Pharisees. If you remember, this is the Tuesday of Holy Week in the story. Jesus has come back into the temple the day after he cleansed the temple, and he is confronted by the temple authorities. They have just questioned him about where his authority comes from, and now Jesus has walked away from that confrontation and begins to speak. It says to them. So we'd have to assume that this is a parable told to the crowds with the expectation that the people who just confronted him are going to be present and hear this. There's an expectation that Jesus is saying this to everybody around him so that everybody knows what's going on, but he is obviously specifically addressing the temple authorities who just questioned him about what authority he has to be in their temple and to be doing the things that he's doing. And he tells them the story of a man who plants a vineyard and then leases it out to tenant farmers. Now, this would have been a common practice. It still is a fairly common practice today. The difference is that instead of paying the landlord in money, the tenant farmers would have probably paid in produce. But it's still the same practice that we have today, where individuals will lease land to farm. Now, the landlord here in this story sends multiple individuals trying to get the percentage of the fruit that he is owed from this vineyard. And it is clearly a story about how the leadership of Israel has been mistreating all of the people that God has been sending to um, to gain or to retrieve what is owed to God. And that is devotion and service and all of the things that we think about in a religious life. And Jesus is clearly saying that the slaves in this story represent the prophets and others who have come to the Jewish officials trying to say, hey, God wants what is owed from in this covenant relationship. Now, it is important for us to recognize that simply because Jesus uses the language of slavery does not mean he endorses the language of slavery, or doesn't mean he endorses the system of slavery. Simply because Jesus is using that language does not mean he endorses it. Rather, he's using it because it's a common motif in the world which they all knew. This is how people operated. A rich person would have lots of domestic slaves and would have sent them on an errand like this. They would have had a good deal of authority coming from the man who owned them. So Jesus is not here endorsing a set of slavery or a system of slavery. He is just using it as an illustration because this is the illustration that would have been familiar to the people at that time. But it is clearly set up as a parable in which the chief priests and the other temple authorities who have just questioned him and said, where do you get off saying what you're saying? Jesus is now saying, I come from God, and God wants what is due. And the chief priests are placed in the position of the tenant farmers who are power hungry, greedy, who want full control over the land and don't want to listen to the landlord. Jesus is saying, not just, he's saying that they are power hungry and that they are going to do whatever it takes to maintain control of the vineyard. They are not actually working it the way the landlord wants. Now, if the chief priests heard this, this would be a major affront because they would have seen themselves as good tenants, good even slaves of the landlord. They would not have seen themselves in a position where they are trying to maintain power and authority. This would not have sat well with them because it would have looked like a false claim to them. But what Jesus is going to back up, and what he's going to say is, you're in league with the Romans, you are in league with other entities, and all you are worried about is maintaining your control over the temple and over the religious structure. You are not actually worried about the things that God is worried about. And he is going to then spell that out in the next few arguments. So at this point, after he tells this parable, we are going to see arguments with the major groups who have power and influence within the Jewish world of the time. So Jesus comes in. He's confronted about his authority and where he claims his authority comes from, and it sets up this collision course. Jesus is then making a counterclaim here that not only do I have the authority, you are the poor tenants of this farm. And then the next few stories are going to be about how Jesus backs up that claim and shows where his authority comes from while undermining the authority of the temple hierarchy. So after he tells this, and obviously the chief priests are kind of mad with it, after he tells them and tells them he's going to be killed, and then says, what do you expect to happen? They come back with the Pharisees come back with a question about taxes. So Jesus has said, hey, you owe a certain allegiance to God, and you're failing on this. And the Pharisees are going to come back and say, well, what do you expect us to do in a world governed by the Romans? What should we do with Caesar? You're making this grand statement about how we are complicit in not giving God his due. What do you say about Caesar? And should we pay taxes? This follows logically from what Jesus has just said. Jesus has just said, you guys are working with the Romans in a way that is wrong. You are trying to create power and a power dynamic for yourselves. And Jesus is going to say, okay, or the Pharisees are going to say to Jesus, okay, what do we do? Do we pay taxes or not? And I should say it's the Pharisees and the Herodians, not just the Pharisees. So it is the religious institution of the Pharisees and the Herodians, the people who are supporting Herod, who is a representative of Rome. So it is the Pharisees coming together with the individuals who represent the Roman government, the religious authority and the political authority working together to maintain power. And this question they ask Jesus is a really good question. It's a really important question. And the reason they ask it, though, is because they want to put Jesus in a bind. They are not asking him a genuine question for advice. They are asking him a trick question designed to make him look bad. If he answers that you don't give taxes to Caesar, well, then he has just committed political treason, and they can have him arrested and executed. If he answers, you do pay taxes to Caesar, then the crowd is going to see him as nothing more than a person like the Pharisees or the Herodians themselves. He is going to seem like the hypocrite in the eyes of the crowds. He has to come up with a way to escape this trap question that shows wisdom. Because no matter what he says, if he gives a straight yes or no answer, he puts himself in a real bind. And this to me, it says something, because Jesus does not shy away from the trap question. And even when the Pharisees should be asking a question to learn and work together, they're asking him trap questions. Jesus is able to confront that, and that shows true true dedication and wisdom. It also shows that the Pharisees aren't actually looking for real engagement. They are looking to try to win the day and to make themselves more powerful, which is something that we should always avoid. But Jesus comes back, and instead of answering a straight yes or no, he asks for a Roman coin. Now, remember yesterday he was in the temple and overturned the money changers and some other and the other institutions, but specifically the money changers. They were there to change Roman coins for temple coins so that Roman coins would not be permitted in the temple proper. The idea that the Roman coins were idolatrous and not worthy of being in the temple was very important to the Jews. So these people who are coming to Jesus saying, well, do we support Caesar or not, are asking Jesus about this. And Jesus says, well, I don't have a Roman coin on me. Does anybody have a Roman coin on them? And one of the accusers hands him a Roman coin. See, this is brilliant because Jesus has just shown that they are in league with Rome. These people who talk about wanting to keep the temple clean and pure are carrying around idolatrous coins. And they want to say Jesus doesn't have the right or the authority to be here, but they're carrying around the Roman money. And Jesus is then going to use that and say, well, this belongs to Caesar, right? Sure, give it to Caesar. If it belongs to Caesar, give it to Caesar. If it belongs to God, give it to God. And that is a really interesting comment because it both answers the question and doesn't answer it to the satisfaction of the Pharisees and the Herodians. It doesn't answer it in the sense of Jesus doesn't give a clear-cut yes, pay taxes, which will turn the crowd against him. And it doesn't give a clear-cut no, which they could have him arrested for. What it does is says to the Pharisees, think about it. What belongs to God? What belongs to Caesar? If it belongs to Caesar, give it to Caesar because it's Caesar's. But if it belongs to God, give it to God. And for us, this is tremendous because we would say everything belongs to God. So in one sense, everything is ours to use on God's behalf, use everything on God's behalf. On the other hand, we show wisdom and prudence about where we give things. So things like taxes aren't inherently bad. Even if we're not giving them directly to God, we can use them for God's service. And this is kind of what Jesus wants us to think about as we think through the obvious question that he has now asked. What is God's and what is Caesar's? How do you relate to God? How do you relate to Caesar? Because that's more important than saying, do we pay taxes? The idea is, why are you paying taxes? What are you paying taxes for? What are you participating in and why? Answer those questions and then you will have the basis for understanding whether or not you should pay those taxes. What does your service to God mean? Answer that question. And then you will have the answers to other more practical questions like, do we pay taxes? He's trying to get us, while this is a clever trick to get out of the direct question that the Pharisees asked, even though it is a trap question, he's trying to get us to think deeper about what we do with our money and why we do it. It's an idea to help us sort out the issues of life in a way that better pleases God. And we might come to slightly different opinions on this, because what it is wisdom in the time and the place. As we think through as we start to think the way Jesus thinks, we begin to answer the questions the way Jesus answers. But that means that there is a little bit of dependence on what is our actual context. Jesus's answer to me today about paying taxes might be different than it was 200 years ago or 2,000 years ago when he was asked this question. because the context has changed slightly. And so if he gives just a straight answer, we aren't going to ask the deeper questions of what are we doing in service to God? And that's the important question that Jesus wants us to get out of this. Anyway, I hope that you're enjoying the series. I would love to hear your feedback and your questions and comments and what you're learning as you go through Mark. So you can drop those below or let me know in another way. As always, God bless, and until we meet again.